So we're going to continue on the book of Joshua, which we've been in since actually January. And we'll continue on until October, November maybe. And you don't want to miss next week. Let me just plug next week. Next week, I'm going to have Paulo share. And if you don't know Paulo, you should get to know Paulo, because the way God moves in his life is just amazing. So I'm going to ask him to share a little bit about how God has been moving in his life. So bring your friends. It's quite entertaining and quite encouraging at the same time. So why Joshua? Joshua is this story of God's people that are journeying through and taking possession of a land that had been promised to them for generations. But the problem with the book of Joshua is the land was inhabited. So even though God said, this is your land, there was still a process that they needed to go through in order to actually claim the land. And what that means for us is we've been talking throughout this whole time about how that process is just as important as the destination. And for us, God has given us promises. God has said certain things about our lives. God has called us righteous. God has said we have joy. But yet, oftentimes, we're not there. Oftentimes, we don't feel that joy. Oftentimes, we don't feel like we're living a righteous life. And so, for us, the journey is very similar in the sense that God said, these things are yours, but we as a people still need to grow in it. We as a people still need to walk in it with God's help. So that's what we've been going through. And we find ourselves now in Joshua chapter 7, and we're going to read verses 1 through 12. But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Last week we talked about Rahab, but before that it was the story of Jericho. So as Israel crosses the river into the promised land, one of the first cities they have to take is Jericho. And God was very specific with them. He said, when you take this city, destroy everything. But we see here that one person named Achan was not willing to do that. And instead of destroying everything and devoting it to the Lord, he took something. And now the Lord's anger burned against Israel. In verse 2, now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is the second city they're about to take, which is near Beth-aven to the east of Bethel, and told them, go up and spy out the region. So the men went up and spied out Ai, and they returned to Joshua. They said, not all the army will have to go up against Ai. Send 2,000 or 3,000 men and take it, and do not weary the whole army, for only a few people live there. Okay, so they check out the next city. The spies see that, and what the spies see is there's not a lot of people, so rather than sending the whole army, let's just send a few. Sounds like a pretty good plan. That way, not everybody is tired after battle, and you save some people for later. Verse 4, so about 3,000 went up, but they were routed by the men of Ai, who killed about 36 of them. They chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries and struck them down on the slopes. At this, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till evening. The elders of Israel did the same and sprinkled dust on their heads. And Joshua said, alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servant, Lord. What can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name? The Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you going down on your face? What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. So this is the first time that Israel lost. Throughout this whole time, they have beaten mighty kings. they beat this mighty city of Jericho, even though there was a wall fortifying the city. And for the first time, this city with very few men actually beats the people of God. And God is very clear. The reason why they lost is because I was not with you. And the reason I was not with you is because you have sinned. If you remember when we first opened up Joshua, one of the things that God said is, I'm going to help you win, but you must obey my commandments. And God has that famous verse, do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth, right? So God is saying, I will help you, but you got to obey my commandments. And all of a sudden, one guy didn't obey, and they lost. This incident in Ai is actually the first time where they deviated from God's plan. Jericho was God's plan, right? How they took Jericho was all from God. God said, march around the city for 7 days and do this. So for the first time, they took Ai not with God's plan, but with man's plan. Because the spies saw with human eyes, hey, this is going to be an easy city to take, and so they made a human decision. And because of that human decision, lives were lost. And because this is the first time where Israel didn't actually ask God, lives were lost. Had they asked God, God probably would have told them ahead of time, hey, you got to take care of this before you actually go in. I don't have a verse for this, but there was another time in Numbers 14 where God said to Israel, do not go up, for the Lord is not among you, lest you be struck down before your enemies. So in Numbers 14, they were about to go fight this other nation, and God clearly told them, don't go fight, because I'm not with you. So had they asked God, most likely, God would have told them, don't go attack the city yet, you got to take care of this other problem. Right? But instead, they didn't ask God. But it's not that they didn't ask God. Okay, I want to be very clear about that. If we live our lives as Christians thinking we have to ask God about everything, we will not be functional people. Right? I know a lot of people, one of my friends, that when he got saved, he felt this need to be led by God in everything. So he would wake up and he would say, God, what do you want me to wear? Right? God, where do you want me to go? And as much as I understand the heart behind that, we cannot be functional humans if we're walking around always asking God, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? Right? God does give us wisdom, but it's not so much that they didn't ask God, it was the attitude had changed. Because up until that moment, every step of the way, their heart was depending on God. And now, at a critical point, it was no longer dependence on God, but the attitude was about dependence on self. And that's where they went wrong. And I think this story here is just a reminder for us that we need to be careful as a church and as individuals that our heart always stay in this posture of dependence on God and not dependence on self. And you know when this sort of thing often creeps up? This sort of change of attitude, I find, in the Bible also, often happens not actually in times of battle, but in times of peace. Isn't that so true? Right? The times where we let our guard down is not always in the heat of battle. Because we talked about a few months ago, sometimes God takes you to this place where you can't do it on your own, right? He takes you to the edge of your Jordan, and so in those seasons, you naturally depend on God. In those seasons where you don't know how it's going to turn out, you don't know how you're going to win, you don't know how you're going to take the city, you naturally turn to God. But in seasons where there's peace, what happens? We start to think that we can figure it out on our own. Don't we? So this sort of attitude creeps up not during the battle, but it actually creeps up after victories. So the first thing I just want us to think about, if we could put up that slide, is stay dependent after victory. Stay dependent after victory. Because I go through a lot of seasons where it's very difficult. And those seasons, I'm depending on God, and it's great because that is the only way I can overcome whatever I'm going through. But then there comes this time where whatever was going on and all the trials that are happening finally stop, and you kind of get this rest. And my attitude, if I'm not careful, is I take that rest, which is necessary, and I feel like I deserve some sort of break, or I deserve some sort of reward. And so rather than being diligent in my heart, rather than keeping track of, is my heart dependent on God, all of a sudden, I let my guard down, and I trust myself. It's really easy for me when times are tough to depend on God, but I find that when things are stable, when we're financially okay, when things aren't going wrong, that's when my dependence on God starts to decrease, and it starts to bleed into dependence on self. We see that in the story of Samson in the Bible, right? Samson, if you don't know, was what's called a judge in the Old Testament. And basically, every time that Samson would get attacked by the enemies, God would give him this supernatural strength to win. And so after a while, Samson started getting a little bit too confident. And there was one moment when he did not realize, here's what the Bible said, Samson did not realize that God had left him, and he lost that battle, and he was captured. And that word left is pretty strong. The idea of that word left is that God had actually turned off something. So for all this time, Samson had been winning because God had been helping him. Now all of a sudden, he starts to think he has something to do with it, and he starts being out of sync with God, and he's no longer attuned to God. And so when the next battle comes, he doesn't realize that God left him. So he goes out to battle, and he loses, right? Stay dependent after the victory. The second thing that I think we can see from this passage is sometimes, okay, can we put up that slide, Lee? Sometimes a spiritual response might be the best response. Here's what I mean. You can tell a lot about a person based on how they respond to very difficult situations, very adverse situations where they have to make a quick judgment. In the Bible, there were two kings in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. There was a King Saul, and there's King David, who came after King Saul. And both men were actually caught in sin. In one situation, King Saul sacrificed something that he shouldn't have because he was not a priest. In the other situation, David murdered or had somebody murdered so that he could have that person's wife, to basically cover up adultery. Now, which one seems worse? To sacrifice something on the altar you're not supposed to, or to have somebody murdered? They're both, I think the murder one is pretty bad. But what's interesting is if you compare the stories of David and Saul, both men were called out, both men were caught, and both men were confronted. So at some point, somebody says, Saul, this is what you did wrong. At some point, somebody says, David, this is what you did wrong. But their reactions were vastly different. In Saul's case, here's what Saul said to the priest. He said, okay, I admit I was wrong, but please come with me. And in essence, what he was saying, so I can still keep my reputation in front of the people. In David's case, when he was called out, he repented because he did not want God's presence to leave him. Same situation, both men caught in sin, yet the reaction of one was, make me look good in front of the people. The reaction of the other is, God, don't leave me. I think that says a lot about their hearts. And I think for us, when we're in very difficult situations, it says a lot about what's inside us. So think about Joshua. What was Joshua's response to this defeat? It said the hearts of Israel melted. They were very discouraged. Joshua's response was crying out to God. Think about it. If I was a general, okay? If I was a general and we had just had this defeat, the things that would go on in my mind is we got to encourage the troops, or we got to prepare for the next battle, or we got to do some sort of public relations so it doesn't seem so bad. Right? There's all these strategic things we could do, but what does it say Joshua did? He fell on his face before the Lord, and he said this, pardon your servant, Lord, what can I say? Now that Israel has been routed by its enemies, the Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out your name from the earth. what then will you do for your own great name? Joshua's reaction was not to plan the next attack. Joshua's reaction was not to tell everybody it's okay. Joshua's reaction was to fall before the Lord. Joshua's reaction was spiritual because Joshua understood that the problem was spiritual and not physical. So for us, I think the message here is sometimes we need to think about our response to a crisis. That maybe sometimes our response to a crisis should be spiritual before it is just physical. And that's very, very difficult for us to do because I, by nature, am a crisis management kind of person. If something goes wrong, I immediately want to think about the solution. But Joshua understood that the root of the problem was not that we were bad soldiers. The root of the problem was spiritual. The root of the problem was a broken relationship with God. Maybe a spiritual response is the best response. Think about some of the most recent things that you have gone through. Was our response to fall before God, or was our response to fix it? Honestly, was our response to pray, or was our response to make something happen on our own? For me, like I said, my tendency is right away to come up with 5 solutions to every problem, and more often than not, prayer is not one of them. But maybe we should think about it, because maybe the source of a lot of our problems is really not physical. Maybe the source of a lot of our problems is actually spiritual. Let me say it this way, okay? We ought and should do other things than pray, but we should do nothing without prayer. Let me say that again. We ought and should do other things than pray, but we should do nothing, especially in big moments, without prayer. How much is God taking the front seat in the decisions that we make? There's a beautiful picture of this in the Bible, back when Moses was still alive. And Moses basically sent Joshua to go fight this nation, the Amalekites. And it's really strange because what Moses did while Joshua was fighting is he would stand on a hill and he would just raise up his arms and hold up the staff of God. And whenever he would raise his arms, Israel would win. But then he was holding up his arms and he would get tired, and whenever he would lower his arms, Israel would start losing. So it's like, what is going on? Why does it seem like it's dependent on this guy holding up his arms? And I think that reminds us that sometimes victory needs to come from a spiritual source, but here's what that story reminds me of. In some things in life, we have to do both the fighting and the praying in order to be victorious. In some things in life, we must fight like Joshua, but also pray like Moses. In some things in life, right, we should and could do other things and pray, but we should do nothing without prayer. What's your response when things go wrong? Is it to go before God, or is it to solve the problem? Right? Joshua understood it's a God problem. The last thing I just want to quickly look at in this story. Let's look at verse 1 again. It says, "But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel." Here's what's interesting about this. Who sinned? Achan. Who sinned? Who did God say sinned? Israel. Right? Think about that. One guy sinned. But if you read God's response later, he says the people sinned. He said the whole nation sinned. It wasn't just one person. I think the message here that we need to understand, especially as a church, okay, is what you do affects others. Achan was the only guy that sinned, but what he did had consequences for the nation as a whole. What you do affects others. The church is this organism where one part of the church can really affect the whole church. Think about how many churches start to fall apart because of the sin of one person. Look at Mars Hill, right? Not to bring up some pretty bad things, but the pastor basically had to step down. That church is in shambles. It doesn't even have to be the pastor. How many times have we seen or heard about where like the secretary of the church or the treasurer of the church took the money? Right? What you do affects others. The picture of God's people in the Old Testament was of a nation. So the identity, how you know that someone is a person of God, was an ethnic identity. Are they in this nation? Are they of the people of Israel? Then that identified them as a person of God. In the New Testament, how are we identified? How is the collective group of God's people identified? The body. There's this shift, right? In the Old Testament, it was this ethnic thing. It was this nation. It was about where you came from, who your parents were. And then all of a sudden, in Corinthians, Paul talks about how God's people is not just a nation. God's people is a body. It's a little bit more intimate. It's a little bit more intertwined. That's why Paul in Corinthians says when one part of the body hurts, the whole body feels it. Right? The illustration always, you stub your toe, your whole body hurts. Right? I do it all the time. What you do can affect others. We as a church have to win and lose as a team. Right now, it's basketball playoffs and hockey playoffs, okay, in the U.S. None of my teams are in, so I don't care. But here's the deal. If one guy messes up and costs the game, guess what? It's not just that guy that loses, his whole team loses. Same thing with the church, right? What one person does has effects for the whole church. What you do could affect the church negatively. But wait. Let's turn it around. What you do could also bless the church, could it not? There's a lot of stories in the Bible where the action of one person actually blessed the whole nation of Israel. Read about Ruth. Read about Esther. Read about these other people of God that just because of their action and their faithfulness, entire nations were blessed and an entire nation was saved. So just as much as what we do can affect others negatively, what we do could affect others and this church positively. You newcomer, I don't know if there's any. You guys should bring some. But if you're a newcomer, what you do could bless this church. Person that's been here 2 years or more, what you do could bless this church. You introvert, what you do could bless this church. You extrovert, you're probably already blessing this church. You who think you have no talent or nothing to give or nothing to offer, what you do could bless this church. You could be the answer to somebody's prayer in this room. God can use you. Look at Rahab, prostitute. God used the prostitute to bless a nation. God could use you. Here's the truth. We need you at this church. We had a members meeting yesterday, and we tried our best as a leadership team to reiterate the fact that if the Pearl is going to thrive, if the Pearl is going to make impact in Taipei, everyone has to help. So I am being very honest as a person up here who is not the pastor, okay? We need help. Can we put up some of the needs that we identified? Okay? Here are some of the needs that we talked about at the members meeting. We need people to connect with newcomers after service and during the week. Do you know how it worked before? Pastor Jeff would stand in the back door and not let you leave without talking to somebody. If you're a newcomer, Pastor Jeff will not be standing by the back door. I am socially awkward. I know up here it seems like, hey, he likes to talk. Down there, I'm just like, please don't talk to me. Leave me. Don't look at me. Don't notice me. I'm very bad at it. But some of you are not. We need you. The website. Anyone out there who's good with technology? Lee will train you. He's going to get a Sai PhD. Okay? He is capable of making a website, and he is capable of making you be a website Jedi. We want to start alpha groups. If you don't know what alpha groups are, it's just a safe environment where people who are new to Christianity or don't know anything about it can come and learn and ask questions. We need people to start that up. I can't do it. I guess I could. I don't think my wife would be happy. I don't know. She's pretty supportive. Right? The Shida courses we talked about. Prime opportunity. God put us here for a reason. We need you, newcomer. We need you, busy person. We need you, introvert and extrovert. Summer community groups. Right now we got one going. We got one plan. We probably need a second one. If you're around in the summer, here's the only qualification to facilitate a summer community group. Be here during the summer. And be willing to serve, right? What you do could bless others. Some of the ideas we came up with at the members meeting. Can we put up that slide, right? We want to utilize this space so we could attract the students at Taida, Shida. We want to hold game nights. We need games. We need someone to step up and say, hey, let's get together. Let's play cards. Let's play music. Let's invite people. Let's advertise. Things like that. Another idea that came up was instead of having like our community groups pretty much run through the year, instead of doing that, why don't we have short-term classes where we can invite people that may not come to a Sunday but would come to a class. And it can be anything. What do you want to teach? Want to teach ballet? We will support you. Look at this space. Want to teach yoga? Right? Look at this space. Okay, I guess that's spiritually questionable. No yoga. Okay, for the more conservative people. Right? You want to teach music? You want to run a class in like business conversation? You want to run a language exchange? Right? We could really, really start connecting with people in the community, but we need you. What you do could affect others. He's not here today, so I can talk about him. But we had a major issue with welcoming and being very welcoming in general, even though we're kind of a small church. Honestly, until Carvel. How many of you have been blessed in some way by Carvel? Can you just wave? Carvel, there were like 2 people. No, right? Like, look at all the people that have been connected through Carvel because his actions blessed you. What he did affected you. We need more Carvels. We cannot clone him. That is morally questionable. Right? Ephesians chapter 4 says this. So Christ himself gave the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. Why? To equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up. Why are there pastors? Pastors are here not to do the stuff, but to equip us to do the stuff. Do you see that? The mentality is not, pastor plan this, pastor do this. The pastor is equipping us. Teachers are equipping us so we could do the stuff, so we could affect others. What you do affects others, no matter how small. I had a friend, and he really wanted to serve, but he had no talent. He was just talentless, right? Like, he couldn't sing. He couldn't cook. He could eat. He could eat. But here's how he served. Every Sunday morning, he would come early, and he would just set up the chairs. And at my old church, we had these giant pillars that would always block the view. And so he would start getting dreams of how to set up the chairs so that no one's view would be blocked. And he'd come and he'd make sure that the chairs were set up just right. Do you think that affected people? I think it did. There's this one church I know of. All they do, what they have the ushers do, is they have the ushers. It's all about chairs for some reason. They have the ushers pray over the chairs. And one usher, she decided, I'm just going to pray over this one chair. I'm not going to pray over all these chairs. Right? Not because her heart was bad, but she just felt like she only needed to pray for this one chair. It's such a little thing. Do you think it affected anything that a person prayed for the chair you're sitting on? Easter service, guess who sat on that chair? Her dad, who she had been praying for years to hear the gospel. Do you think that made a difference? I think so. What you do can affect others. So here's what we're going to do. A lot of you wonder what community groups are like. A lot of you are scared or don't know how to actually get plugged into a community group. So we're just going to simulate a mini 5-minute, don't freak out, community group and what it's like to show you that it's not weird, we don't sacrifice goats, okay, and it's actually very encouraging. And the purpose for this is not just to plug community groups, but to let the body, to let you affect someone's life with your story, to let you encourage somebody with your story. So let me put the questions up, and then I'll explain how we're going to do this, okay? 3 questions, and here's what we're going to do. We're just going to get into groups of 3 at most. 3, maybe 4. Otherwise, it's going to take too long. Groups of 3, when I tell you, and you're just going to answer, each person just answer one of these questions. Share a time when someone was the answer to your prayer. Share a time when you were able to be a blessing to one person or a group of people. How can the Pearl positively affect the community around us? So just one of those 3 questions. Just share with people around you, forming groups of 3, 4 at the most. And then if you have time, pray for each other. Very simple. Okay, are we worried? Are we okay? If you are like have social anxiety, just get over it for now, okay? See, I'm not very caring. That's why we need someone to be more caring. I'm just like, quit it, forget it, move on, right? So could we do this for just 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'll close this in prayer. So move your chairs, get to know people, try to meet people that you haven't met, and just share life. That's all we're doing.